in progress.
Hey, Don, welcome.
Hi, how you doing, everybody?
Hi, Don.
Hi. Hi, Greg. Hi, Marshall.
How are you?
Still here.
I see that.
All right, why don't we get started? So Laura, would you do roll call, please?
Commissioner Targ,
Here.
Commissioner Haskell,
Here.
Commissioner Golden,
Present.
Vice Chair Koff-Still,
Here.
Chair Taylor.
Present. All right, great. Well, welcome, everybody. We've got 8 attendees tonight. So as usual, we start with oral communications. This is an opportunity for the public to comment on anything that's not on tonight's agenda. So is there anybody who would like to make general public comment to the Planning Commission? All right, so Marcin, you're up. Welcome.
Hello.
Yeah, hi, we can hear you.
Great. My name is Marcin. I'm a resident from the Stonegate Road. I just came back to the country after vacation. I learned that we're going to consider the Spring Ridge Cap, at least in ASCC, in August. And I think many residents will be unavailable in August due to travel. And this cap is highly controversial, with many people supporting it, many people against it. And I wanted to ask to postpone this consideration to a better time where more people can participate. I think this is relevant for the Planning Commission. As I understand, the ASCC is advisory body to the Planning Commission. I also wanted to add that on April 26th ASCC meeting, Ms. Russell told us that residents living within the 1,000 feet of the winery will be notified about the meeting considering the COP. We live very close by, and we so far have not received any communication. So we think there's just not enough time between now and August, given that people are traveling, and especially now they're in hurry traveling because COVID restrictions may be coming even harsher to notify everyone. So again, we would like to ask to consider postponing this consideration. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Is there any other public comment for things that are not on tonight's agenda? All right, so seeing none, let's move into the actual agenda. So the new business for tonight is the accessory dwelling unit fire safety checklist. Laura, do you have a presentation for us?
I do, thank you. Just a second as I share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that well?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Yes.
great.
Great, thank you.
So tonight we are joined by Don Bullard, who's our fire marshal, and also by Marshall Hurd, who's a senior inspector and captain, to talk about this item tonight. So this is the accessory dwelling unit fire safety checklist. I am going to give a little bit of background that will be some repeat for the Planning Commission in case there's members of the public that are just picking up on this item. So as an overview, we're going to have the staff presentation. And then if the commission has questions for staff and for the fire marshal, we'll take those questions then public comments, and then the commission discussion and decision. There's a resolution before you that's included in the packet for you to consider. So as a reminder, that what we're calling the July 2021 ADU amendments included a state allowance for 4-foot setbacks. And that raised a number of concerns with the Planning Commission. And so the Planning Commission recommended and the Town Council approved a multifaceted approach to try to address those 4-foot setbacks that are required by the state and make it more appropriate for our local context. And so the Planning Commission developed a carrot and stick approach with incentives to encourage applicants to comply with our local setbacks according to the base zoning district, and to discourage the use of the state allowed 4-foot setbacks. So there's a number of things that were included in the ordinance to this effect. And then of particular concern related to the 4-foot setbacks was related to fire safety. So on that topic, there were a couple of different components that are included in the ordinance that the council has adopted. The first is something that's carried forward from the previous ADU amendments. And this is a prohibition on ADUs on parcels that are less than 1 acre. And who has direct vehicular access from a road or cul-de-sac, which has number 1, a single point of ingress and egress, and number 2 has a width of less than 18 feet. So with this last code amendment, we adopted the health and safety findings, and that helps to support that prohibition that we have in our ordinance. So this one is carrying forward. The next one is a setback requirement. And so this is for ADUs on parcels that are 1 acre or larger in that same area. So the same criteria about a single point of access and a width less than 18 feet. And in those cases, then the setback of the base zoning district would apply, not the 4-foot setback that the state has. And again, we adopted findings to support this determination. And then the next item is something that the Planning Commission was thinking about different ways to address the fire safety concerns. And we had some language drafted. We weren't sure if that was going to work, and we were working it through a couple of meetings. And staff had a meeting with the Woodside Fire Protection District, with the chief and with the fire marshal. That included the town manager, town attorney, myself, and Councilmember Hughes, who's the liaison. So we all met together to try to think about how to address this. And out of that meeting came this idea for the fire safety checklist. And the fire safety checklist would apply for any ADU that does not comply with the setback of the base zoning district. So that's when the checklist would come into play. And this would apply townwide. The way that it's adopted by the council, it applies townwide, not just in that restricted area that we talked about previously. So we're talking about that checklist specifically tonight. So it came naturally for planning staff and the fire marshal to develop this together, since the idea really came out of that joint meeting. So I've been working with Fire Marshal Bullard on this. So we took the recommendations that the town has already considered from the Ad Hoc Wildfire Preparedness Committee. We took the recommendations out of the town's current work that we're doing on the building codes for home hardening. That will be back to Planning Commission again in the future. Drawing from the fire marshal's experience and expertise, we put those items together, excuse me. And then we did a quick review with the chair of the Conservation Committee so that she could take a look at the language related to landscaping and make sure that she didn't see any issues with implementation. And we made a minor change to wording based on her feedback. So that's how we developed the checklist in the last couple of weeks. So now on to what the checklist includes. So the first category is related to site planning. And this has 2 elements. And the first one is a setback when there's a slope. So the idea is that fires tend to move up a slope in a canyon situation or when there's a steep slope. And we want these ADUs to be set back 100 feet from the edge of that slope if the slope is 20% or greater, to reduce the likelihood of that ADU being in the path of a fire that may be coming up a steep slope. And then the second item is to really expressly say no attached structures. So this really builds on and amplifies what the Planning Commission already recommended that's in the ordinance, to say that there's no amenities associated with the ADU. This goes a step farther and really specifies and clarifies things like decks, balconies, patio covers, trellises, carports would not be allowed, no attached structures. The next category is ADU construction. And the first one I think is an important one. And we are recommending that fire sprinklers be required for these ADUs that are located in the setback. Now, we did talk about this quite a bit. And the Planning Commission is aware that the state law generally does not allow us to require sprinklers if the main house doesn't have them. but there are some limited opportunities to limit ADUs within the state law. And we know when we've talked about that it's really a badly worded statute. So as we were thinking about all of this and the concerns that were raised by the commission and by the public, we staff think that this is an appropriate time to push on this, to try something. We don't know whether it'll be approved by HCD, but we do think it's appropriate to try to require sprinklers in this case. We think this will give us some information and we can build on this for future efforts. And we really think about this as an ongoing work that we're doing, right? This is not a one-time thing. We try to make each step of the process a little bit stronger and more fire safe. So it is our recommendation to try in this case to require fire sprinklers and see if that works for us. The next item is related to design, and this came out of the Wildfire Prep Committee. They recommend that roofs have a very simple design. So there's just one ridge, like a simple gable end roof or a simple shed roof, no dormers, no places that leaves and debris and things like that can gather. So that's been included here. And then we are including requirements for non-combustible materials. So I just want to explain that this is going beyond what's called ignition resistant materials. So ignition resistant is very common. Most things in town right now are ignition resistant from newer construction. This is taking a step further than that and requiring non-combustible materials in key places. So that includes the roofing material that would have to be materials like tile, metal, slate, certainly not wood shingle and not regular composition shingle anymore. The gutters and the gutter covers would have to be non-combustible material, the even closure non-combustible, and then also important, the exterior walls and siding. So cement board, stucco, stone, those types of products. So we would not have cases where you could have wood materials that had been treated. So no more treated wood materials as exterior materials on these ADUs. And then fences and gates within 10 feet of the ADU would also have to be non-combustible material. Then the next category are things that I consider to be kind of accepted best practices and things that really reinforce and build on Building Code Chapter 7A. So as a reminder, this is a section of the building code that applies to projects that we refer to as in the WUI, or the very high hazard severity zones. The town has this chapter, the building code applies townwide. We have since 2009. And this is just taking some best practices around chimneys, windows and skylights and vents, and making sure we're bringing that to people's attention. And vents maybe going a step further, but mostly calling this out so that people understand what their requirements are and can plan for it. And then moving on to landscaping and defensible space. The checklist includes tree removal of what people have been calling the flammable 5. So that's acacia, juniper, cypress, pine, and eucalyptus. So if you propose one of these ADUs, you would have to remove any of those trees that are located within 100 feet of the ADU. And then we're also recommending that any new planting within 30 feet of the ADU should comply with the list that's generated by the Conservation Committee of native and fire safe planting material. And these numbers come from commonly used numbers in fire safety related to defensible space. So that's why we've chosen these distances of 100 feet and 30 feet. So speaking a little bit more about those distances and those zones, these circles are not to scale, of course, but imagine that the ADU is in the middle and the first zone 1 is from 0 to 5 feet. And in that area, you would only have non-flammable mulch, stone, hard surfaces. You don't want anything flammable in that first 5 feet. And you would only have low growing, non-woody ground cover. So things that are very unlikely to spread fire in that immediate distance. And then in zone number 2 is from 5 to 30 feet. And so here defensible space requirements apply that are outlined in the checklist. And in this area, new planting is according to that Conservation Committee checklist that I just mentioned. And then the next zone is 30 to 100 feet. And again, defensible space requirements apply here. And then this whole area is where the flammable 5 tree removal would be required. And then the idea is what we want them to do in their plan submittal sheets is to actually have a planned sheet that includes these circles on it. And they would have to show what plants they're removing, what they're planting, how they're going to meet their defensible space requirements on paper in advance, instead of doing those things in the field, so that we could really ensure that they've made a commitment to do it and we've got those things in the record. So the next steps from here are as I mentioned, there's a resolution for the Planning Commission to consider this evening. We would recommend that you forward it to Town Council for their consideration. They would be looking at it at their next meeting, so that this checklist could go into effect at the same time as the updated ADU ordinance. So the council really stressed to staff that they wanted these to sync up as much as possible. So that's why we brought this forward to you as quickly as we could to be able to meet that timing. So with that, I'm happy to receive any questions and comments. And like I said, the fire marshal is the expert on a number of these specific things. And so if you've got questions about the measures that we're proposing, I can certainly try to answer from my perspective as appropriate. And then he's here to do that as well. So we'll go ahead and be happy to take questions.
Great. Thank you, Laura. So are there any clarifying questions for either staff or for the fire marshal? John, go ahead.
So my question is from a timing perspective, assuming it goes through and is approved by the council, roughly when would we expect to hear back from the state as to whether or not we've been successful with some of our carrot and stick approaches?
My understanding is that it can take some time. We've heard different things from different cities that have submitted. I don't know, Cara, if you've heard anything specific from anyone. I would suspect it will take months to hear back.
And does that mean that these are in force until we hear back?
Yes.
Is that it, John?
Yes, thank you.
Judith, you had questions?
Yeah. So non-combustible versus fire resistant standard. In the home hardening guidelines to be, is that non-combustible used in those contemplated home hardening recommendations, or is this going beyond what we think would generally apply?
Let me start and then maybe Dawn can chime in. That's one of the things that we've been working on with that ordinance, is to really be clear when we're proposing non-combustible and when we're proposing ignition resistant. So that's one of the things we're working through, but I expect that ordinance to probably have both categories that apply to different things. So Dawn, do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was something that I made an observation on later in the day today, and I didn't get a chance to talk to you about it, Laura. But there's a couple things. One, I'll deal with the non-combustible issue first, and then I'm going to have you go back to the slide where we talked about the tree removal after I talk about that. And then I want to see if there's any objections from any of the town council on adding in some additional defensible space code language into that we normally use already, which is already on our inspection forms. And I'll tell you why I thought that might be better to add that in there now rather than later. So to deal with the non-combustible, several of the provisions require non-combustible materials, but they don't reference a standard by which to certify the compliance with the requirement. Now, the NFPA distinguishes between ignition resistant and non-combustible materials and specifies a variety of specific standards based on the material involved. In other words, if it's siding, roofing, or doors. And I thought maybe we should add that in there now to head off any problems with this in the future, because I think that that could potentially come up. And so if we establish a checklist based on the minimum standards for certification for non-combustible versus ignition resistance, then we would have that covered. And that would be easy to reference right out of NFPA.
Part of the definitions section or something?
Right, part of the definition section. And then the second thing I wanted to do, is there any other questions on that? How do you guys feel about that?
Yeah, well, this is just our clarifying question time. So my clarifying question is, I know we're working through it, but because we want this to get through HCD, I'm just wondering about how strongly you feel, frankly, about non-combustible versus resistant for this area. I would just like the benefit of your view, Mr. Bullard.
Non-combustible is non-combustible, so it's going to be much better than the ignition resistant. Ignition resistant can still use wood products. And so if we are talking about true non-combustible materials, it's much safer. And that's why I would want to go with it.
And are like asphalt composite shingles considered resistant or non-combustible?
That would be considered ignition resistant. A metal roof would be non-combustible.
Right. So then I think the question here is, if I could sort of rephrase what Judith is asking is, assuming we have to get this sort of approved through the housing authority, if they were to say, no, you've made this too restrictive, I mean, should we be pushing this most restrictive thing, or should we basically find something that still covers most of what we want, but is a little less restrictive with a better chance of getting approved? And so I think she was looking for your, not what the differences are, but more how important is it that we really just push completely for non-combustible? Is that a fair characterization, Judith?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, there's a balance here, and non-combustible, I understand why we want it. I'm just not sure how much of an impediment it will be relative to the benefit.
It's a good question. Are you worried about going back to the drawing board after they say no, and it's going to take too much time?
A little bit. Yeah, because there's a couple of other areas. I have two more questions after this that are unrelated, and then I'm done. But then when we come back to discuss it, that's going to be the line we're trying to toe, right?
Right. If we had all the time in the world, I would prefer to push for it to have the non-combustible. But that being said, if we're going to be meeting all of our access requirements, and we're going to be able to get to these structures, I suppose ignition resistant could potentially be sufficient.
Did you have more? I just had two questions to run through for maybe staff. It might be for you as well. Should I just do those, or did you have something else you wanted to cover first, Fire Marshal?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about, Laura, can you go back to the defensible space slide?
Yeah, just a second. This one?
One more back, I believe. Yes, that one right there. So in looking over the checklist today, I was looking at it, and under landscaping and defensible space, the only thing we have listed is tree removal. And then we talk about the flammable 5 and then coyote brush and broom within 100 feet of the proposed ADU. What I'm proposing is that we add some more language to that, and I want to see if there's any objections. But our normal language for our defensible space in our format states weeds, grass, vines, or other growth that is capable of being ignited and endangering property shall be cut down and removed. Non-fire resistant vegetation or growth shall be kept clear 100 feet or to the property line. Basically, I would like to add that language in there because that covers much more of what we're really concerned about than just the flammable 5. That would include the poison oak vines. It would include the coyote brush. It would include the Scotch broom, the tall dry grasses, all the things that we worry about.
So you've actually raised one of my other questions indirectly, so I'll throw it out there and then people can weigh in or we can punt on it until we discuss. But the 100 feet, the way it's phrased in the checklist, is the intent that the 100 feet is measured within the property requesting to build the ADU? Or,
Correct.
okay, because that's not clear. It just says they shall be removed.
I agree.
And I think, for me, I was thinking these are just checklists for the property owner as to the property. And if you can confirm that, we can work on wording later.
Yeah, that could state tree removal or the language that I just mentioned within 100 feet or to the property line.
Okay.
Good. I had that question too.
Yeah. And the same for the new planting. All of this just refers to the property owner requesting the ADU in their property. It doesn't go over their fence to the neighbors, right?
That's right. Yeah. It's
Okay.
always to the property line. We don't,
Okay.
unless we're talking about, the only situation I could think of would be when we're dealing with like open space where they allow a 100-foot easement onto their property for a property owner to clear further over the property line. That's
Okay, thank you.
not the case here.
Okay, those are my questions, Craig. I'll hand it back.
Thanks, Judith. Go ahead, Ann.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I had a bunch of questions. My first one's on this 20% slope and then putting the ADUs 100 feet back. And I understand the intent that if there's an upslope, you don't want the ADU perched where the fire runs up. You need it put way far back. Portola Valley's hilly, so this will eliminate the ability for people to build these 4-foot ADUs in lots and lots of the town. Laura or Mr. Bullard, do you have any estimate on how many properties this would affect?
I have no idea how many properties it could affect.
Mhm.
Basically you're talking about a lot of 20% slopes within Portola Valley,
Yeah.
which are, in my opinion, you shouldn't be building a structure at the top of that slope because it's
Yeah.
dangerous. Public safety is going to be a problem if you do that.
Mhm. Yeah, my impression, I just wanted to ask you all, is that, yeah, this is going to affect a lot of properties. Then I have some details. The way it's written now, it says if you're within, or if you're near a 20% slope, you have to be 100 feet away. But am I right? This should be upslope. Like if there's a slope like this, you have to get your ADU way back 100 feet. But what if somebody, I can think of some lots like on Possum and Willowbrook where the lot's flat and then there's a hill in the back, and these properties happen to be kind of wet, in my opinion. The way this is written now, an ADU could not be built here because at the bottom of the 20% slope, because you have to be away from it. Is the intent that you just can't be near the upslope? Am I right? It would be okay to build, here's a 20% slope. It's okay to build an ADU here.
Yeah, what you're trying to avoid is the upslope side.
Yeah.
Because fire travels uphill very hot, very fast, and those convective heat waves, the flux from that fire is ahead of that fire front, and it's impinging on that structure.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. I think when we get to the discussion, I'm going to recommend that we change the word in that to be upslope so that it would allow be built next to a 20% slope if it's at the bottom of it. Also, do you all think it's clear, this 20% slope, like what if, I know there's a detail, but we're the planning commission, we have to think through what how every homeowner and builder is going to think about this. If the lot was basically flat, but had a little, can I call it a berm, like a little 4-foot, hump in it where the garden went up, would they count that as a 20% slope and then you can't use your whole lot to build an ADU? What's going to trigger a section being called 20%? I'm trying to ask.
Yeah, that's not the intent, but I see your
Mhm.
point. Yeah, that's not the intent. So that would be something we would have to do with language, huh, Laura?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think we'd have to think about the language for that. And
Yeah.
since,
Yeah.
the goal, if the planning commission agrees, would be to move this forward from the planning commission to the council. So if you wanted to give us direction on how you would like to see that implemented and let us work through the final language and take it to council, that would certainly be an option that you could discuss in your discussion portion.
Sounds good. And then this follows on to my colleagues' questions about the ACD and the process. I think we're all unclear, but I'm certainly unclear. If we propose something that we think is good and makes our community more fire safe, but HCD thinks we're just being anti-housing, what's the process? Do they give us a chance? If they say, no, you can't do that, that was too much, you went overboard. Do we get to can we just at our next planning commission meeting go, oh, okay, we'll tweak it and make a new one? Do we get to iterate kind of quickly? Because then there's not such a penalty to propose something that they might be against, right? We can kind of keep fixing it. But if they bring down a hammer or say, no, you have to live with the state rules from January 1st, the ones that went into effect at the beginning of 2020, because we don't like what you proposed. So sorry. Do you know what the process is there?
So the process is not totally clear because it's relatively new to be doing this. But we do think that there would be some back and forth with HCD to try to understand what they would expect to see. And then we could bring that back and we could do that quickly. And I think we could, especially because this checklist is separate from the ordinance. So we've got things in the ordinance and they'll be reviewing that. This checklist is adopted by resolution, the way that we have it set up, which can be a faster process because then we don't have to go through this exact same steps. So I think that we could, change this quickly if we were not approved by HCD.
Okay, that makes me feel good. Yeah, because I like I like the gist of what's proposed here. And this, I know this one is kind of minor, but I feel like the title should be something different. When it's called checklist, and even when at our previous meeting that I looked over the notes, checklist was going to be about the materials and the vegetation. That to me, I don't know, feels like a checklist. This criterion about which properties, that feels dramatic to me. I mean, I think there's many properties in Portola Valley, maybe even most, that will not be able to build within 4 feet because of their slope. I kind of feel like the word should be something different, like requirements or something, rather than checklist, which makes it, I think people would think, oh, I'm going to plan my ADU and then I'm going to look at the surfaces I put on there. So I guess I'm asking, can we change the title? We can, maybe that's more for the discussion.
Yeah, so the ordinance refers to a checklist and it is a little bit deliberate on our part because we are trying to create objective standards. So we're trying to create something that can be approved at a ministerial level and someone can just look at it and say, this is objective and it applies to this project. So it is a little bit strategic on our part to show that we're aligning with the law that wants us to have objective rules.
Okay, I can live with it. Okay, that's all my questions. Thanks.
Good, thanks, Ann. Nicholas, you have any clarifying questions? You're on mute.
Yeah, I think that my questions are more in the form of discussion. I will have questions for the fire marshal. But again, I think that those are more in the form of discussion, if that's most appropriate.
Okay, yeah, great. I mean, obviously, we'll have a discussion shortly. Okay, I had a couple of questions and this is either to staff or the fire marshal. So if there are existing trees on the property where they want to put the ADU, did I understand that you're basically going to have to cut down everything within 30 feet?
No,
Okay, so how does that sort of get, I mean, how do we distinguish between, what stuff is okay and what stuff's not?
well, that's where I wanted to put the language in for the defensible space. It pretty much defines that. But
Okay, so it's really just this sort of flammable 5 plus
exactly,
grasses, coyote bush. So like oak trees, redwood trees, things like that aren't part of what we're trying to capture.
no, what it does state in there about the trees is it says, there is a portion here that says, trees are allowed within the defensible space, provided limbs located less than 6 feet above ground have been removed and the horizontal distance between the crowns of adjacent trees, structures, or electrical facilities, and unmodified fuel is not less than 10 feet. Those are common defensible space protocols that we follow.
So that would
In the
mean
code.
you'd have to cut the branches back 10 feet from the roof line, that kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, that,
Yeah, okay.
have to
Yeah,
do that
I'm just trying
anyway,
to
yeah.
understand what it is that we're defining.
right.
Great, thank you. Then the other question, and this is a little bit playing to both Judith and Ann's question. If HCD were to come back and say, oh, this is too restrictive, is it, and I'm going to be careful because I have all these lawyers here, but is it sort of severable in the sense of, does the rest of the ordinance that they don't object to stay in place and it's just the piece that they object to? Or if they object to any part of the ordinance, then the whole thing gets thrown out until we come up with something that they approve? I don't know who can answer that, but you get what I'm after?
Yeah. So I will take a stab at answering that. This is a brand new process, so we don't know what position HCD will take. They have approved a couple of ordinances, but we don't have any information on ordinances that they have rejected and what type of notice they give to the agency and what type of impact that will have on the other provisions. We do have a severability section in our ordinance, and so we would certainly make that argument. I would assume that there, as Laura mentioned, there will be some discussions and negotiations with HCD, and so that would be something that we would certainly bring up with them, and we would try to make sure that the bulk of the ordinance remains and that the one offending provision would be stricken. That would be our approach to the discussions with HCD.
Okay, but we don't know, just because there's just not enough data right now, whether we'd be successful at that.
Correct.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, so that's all I have.
Hey,
Assuming,
if I may,
yeah,
actually, I have a couple of quick questions. And that is, if we were to include an appeal process such that a homeowner who sought to build an ADU wanted to have an exception from one of the requirements here, would, I guess, from a fire marshal efficiency standpoint, would that create an insurmountable obstacle, or should there be any other limitations that to that kind of approach? The virtue of the approach is that it would be harder for HCD to make a finding of the language as being a subterfuge, for example. On the other hand, it may create some administration problems with administration. So I'm wondering if perhaps Cara and the fire marshal might have a view on that. And you'll understand, and you'll excuse me if this is more in the form of discussion than it is in the form of clarification.
So if I understand the question correctly, if object to one of these requirements, would it throw things off so much that we wouldn't be able to do it? Is that what is that the context of your question?
A little bit. If we had language, for example, that said an applicant may appeal or may propose an alternative form to secure a comparable fire safety, that might allow some flex in the checklist or the requirements that could be helpful on one side. On the other hand, it would create some additional burden on the fire, on you, and also on staff. And I'm trying to understand whether that kind of approach is feasible or whether it would be administratively too challenging to include.
So I would say, Don, if you want to think about this a little bit, we could bring this back up in the discussion. I mean, since it's I think a fairly meaty piece of discussion.
If I might also, we did include that language for the fire sprinkler requirement because we thought that that requirement is probably the one that HCD will look the hardest at. And so we do have an appeal process built into the checklist that would allow a request for an alternate measure. And that is a fairly typical practice in implementing the building code. This is unfortunately, I think for the fire district, this checklist really falls under the purview of the fire district. And so it really is a resource issue for them. So it certainly is possible from a legal standpoint to, and preferable to expand the appeal process to other elements. But again, I think that it's appropriate to hear later from the fire district as to whether they can accommodate those appeals.
Laura, was the intent that the planning department was going to use this?
It would be used by the planning department when we do our plan check. And then we would also have our outside plan check firm that does building permit plan check. We would give it to them also, and the checklist would go with them. So they would be looking at it for construction materials. And then also the fire district, when you do your plan check, you would also have the checklist in front of you. So we would have to, make sure that we're covering all of our bases between those three parties.
So the appeal process would have to go through all three.
If someone wanted to appeal, I think the decision would rest with you, and then the rest of us would have to implement your decision.
And
We
Laura,
would be using your authority for an alternative means and methods, I think.
The only thing about the alternative means and methods for automatic fire sprinkler systems, that's kind of in reverse order the way we do things. We typically will, if they can't meet any of the other requirements and the ADU doesn't require sprinklers, what we'll do is we'll say, well, okay, if you can't meet the 150-foot distance mark from where we stage our engine, then we'll allow you to put the ADU further back on the property, but you're going to put sprinklers in. But there isn't anything for the reverse. You know what I'm saying? If they say, well, we don't want to put sprinklers in, there isn't an alternative means that's going to work as well as sprinklers do.
Well, I think the
I wondered
alternative
what that
means
sentence meant. Yeah, okay,
So I think we
Can-
should take that out of there. Yeah.
me
Yeah.
Okay, so
too.
can I suggest, we're starting to dive into discussion, so that's what I was trying to, let's not go too deep into this
Okay.
right now. Laura, I had one other question related to the checklist, is just given the way you just described it. So you're saying that this checklist is not sort of done by the applicant before they submit? Because I know one thing we talked about is the timelines on ADU approval are pretty tight. And I thought we were trying to get all this stuff front loaded so we didn't run into this thing where ADUs just get approved because the approving agencies run out of time. So where do you see this checklist being sort of done, so to speak?
The applicant fills out the checklist, and the way that we have it set up, they would actually list like the location, like the sheet number for each of these different items, and turn in the checklist along with their plans and materials. Then the people doing the plan check will have the checklist in front of them and confirm that those things have actually been met.
So and then we'll move it on to the public comment and then the discussion. So if they handed you a checklist and say, we want an exemption to one of these things, you are going to know about it before it's gone to any agency. It's not going to bounce around back and forth and back and forth. It's going to be, they're making this request, and then you're going to decide whether to consider it right up front before it starts going through the other approvals.
Yeah, that's what we would have to do. If we write this in, we would have to do that. It would add some complexity.
Yeah.
So we can maybe talk about it some more with discussion.
Yeah, perfect.
But
Okay.
if my understanding is, we've deemed that the application is not complete, so the clock does not start until we have that checklist.
Right.
So if they appeal it and it has to go to multiple parties, the clock has not started.
That's the idea. Yes.
Okay, so we'll talk more in discussion. So, all right, assuming there's no more clarifying questions, I'd like to open it up for public comment. So it's now open for public comment. We have 9 attendees. Karen, you're up. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. This is Karen Batra on the Wildfire Committee. I just wanted to add something about ignition resistant versus non-combustible. It's a huge difference. Ignition resistant is at best will burn or melt or collapse at 400 degrees Celsius. But when we're talking about non-combustible materials, they really won't break down. They don't really burn, they break down. They kind of collapse because it's so hot, and that's like 1,000 Celsius. So that really enables the fire to get a lot closer before the house will collapse or interfere with anything else. So I would strongly recommend that you keep it as non-combustible. And asphalt shingles, they are made out of petroleum, and oil burns and they can melt. They're better than wood shingles, but there are other alternatives for a shingle style roof that is non-combustible, like clay or steel coated metal or other choices. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Great, thank you, Karen. All right, Bob Turcott, you're up next. Welcome, Bob.
Hi, thank you. I applaud the incorporation of a checklist and the new additions for sprinklers, for example, but I fear this is an insufficient compensation for an ordinance that allows new construction in high hazard areas that don't enforce all existing National Fire Protection Association standards. You heard and considered this ordinance without public input from fire professionals. You heard staff frequently note that state law precludes application of basic NFPA standards such as site-specific hazard and risk assessment, 30-foot minimum structure separation off-street parking, et cetera. You heard this was, we could not impose that. You heard once that, you heard staff acknowledge that state law does allow municipalities to exclude the ADU mandates from areas as needed for public safety. What you didn't hear is any acknowledgement that the legislature defers the responsibility and authority to address the safety needs of its citizens to the local municipality. While issuing these mandates, the state expects Portola Valley to exclude areas as needed for public safety. That's why the exception for public safety is included in the code. 61% of our area has been documented by multiple independent professionals to be at significantly elevated fire hazard, but the town's ADU restricted area only addresses 1/6 of that. When you were considering the fire station renovation, you saw Chief Lidner attend 3 planning commission meetings. You heard him share his expertise on weighty issues such as parking, whether a wedgewood tree 6 feet from the station should be removed, and whether its wood could be repurposed as a table for his crew. But in none of the 3 meetings leading up to your decision to approve the ordinance amendment, did you hear any public commentary from any fire protection professional about the wisdom of not exercising the safety exception provision? Will allowing new construction in high hazard areas that fails to meet current national standards increase the risk to the community, decrease the risk to the community, or have no effect on the risk? Does the siting of ADU affect risk? For example, suppose an ADU is proposed in the canyon chimney 50 feet upwind of an evacuation route. If the slope is less than 20 degrees, would this checklist preclude such construction? If NFPA standards can't be applied according to state law, wouldn't safety demand that we revise the ordinance to allow the mandated substandard ADUs in low hazard areas in the town and add a second ordinance to allow ADUs in moderate and high hazard areas, provided they meet the current basic NFPA standards? Can we hear the fire professionals comment on these issues? Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Rusty, looks like you're up next. Rusty Day, welcome.
Thank you very much, Craig. I want to commend the Planning Commission. I think you've done a real service to the town. This proposed checklist is a big improvement over the ordinance that was presented initially. And it's because of you and the questions you asked that we're at this point where we have a checklist. It was, I think, partly your incredulity that the Woodside Fire Protection District did not review and approve the safety of these applications that prompted the call for a checklist and prompted the involvement of the fire department in formulating the checklist. So I applaud you for that. I think we owe you a big thank you for making that happen. The checklist incorporates much, not all, much of what the fire district has put in its structural assessment guide for the last 4 or 5 years. And I strongly recommend the Planning Commission to ask Fire Marshal Bullard to give you that structural assessment guide so you can see what's different between his guide for a safe structure and what's in the checklist. There are 2 important things that I think are different that I want to call out for your attention. The first one is that the guide begins with a site assessment. Where are you placing this structure in relationship to everything around it, to the buildings around it, to the vegetation around it? In other words, in the concept of the National Fire Protection Association, what kind of fuel plot complex are you creating by adding this structure to the landscape where you propose to put it? That's a critical question. And Fire Marshal Bullard's structural assessment guide begins with that fundamental question. I don't see that in the checklist. That comes to the second point that I want to make. I listened tonight to some questions about whether placing a ADU at the top of a slope is more hazardous than placing it at the bottom of the slope. Well, if your concern is to protect the ADU from a forest fire, the answer is yes, it's more hazardous to put it at the top of the slope. If your concern is to protect all of the upslope neighbors from a fire, then your concern is about putting it at the bottom of a slope. And that's why you have to have a site assessment. Where is this in relationship to the topography, the vegetation, the canyons, the ravines, the hillsides, the wind, all of those things matter. And so I would just urge you to, I think, go forward with the checklist. I'm not suggesting not go forward, but I'm suggesting this is an open issue. This requires a lot more care, a lot more intention, and a lot more involvement of the fire department than it's getting. And it needs to be informed by the hazard and risk assessment that we're mandated to perform in this town so that you can answer these questions. I venture to say that's going to show you want non-combustible surfaces, and those non-combustible surfaces should be tied to a specific standard, ATSM E136, so that
Hey, Rusty, I'm going to ask you to start to wrap it up.
it should be tied to a specific standard. And if you tie it to that specific standard, I suspect you're going to find that it's less costly to build with non-combustible surfaces than many of the combustible surfaces or ignition resistant surfaces that are in fact used. So specifying with precision what the standard is more likely to get HCD approval than leaving some vague, undefined non-combustible, which can be interpreted anyway by the locality. Thank you.
Thanks, Rusty. Okay, is there any other public comment before I close? Christy Corley, go ahead, Christy.
Can you clarify your guidelines on the scenic corridor?
Is that a public comment or just a general question?
I'm asking the question, yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Are there any other public comments? All right, so seeing none, I will close the public comment and open it up for commission discussion. Who would like to start off? Silence all around. All right, John, go ahead. You're on mute.
Thank you. So the main purpose of this checklist, in my belief, was to be part of the STIC process. And it feels to me like we may have gotten a little bit into, oh, these are the things we'd like to see in general for fire safety in Portola Valley, and trying to sort of like rush into that and put it into this checklist. And I'm guessing, because we're all hypothesizing here about how this would be received, but it feels to me like it might be too far out of the range compared to where we're going to end up with the standard. So for instance, the non-combustible versus fire resistant. If we end up with our general regulation being non-combustible, then I think we're fine. But if we end up with our general regulation not saying non-combustible and we put this super tight restriction on just the ADUs, I think that's going to be called out as you kind of went too far here, you know. So again, I'm back to this, what's a stick here? So I don't want us to get too far down the path of hopefully we're addressing all of this with our general fire regulations. And I hope we end up with a lot more there, that clearly these are some of the items that have to be discussed as part of that. At the same time, again, this is meant to be a stick that's trying to dissuade people and to persuade them to stick within our general setbacks. So in the course of that, for instance, I'd be tempted to say, well, let's not have an appeals process, because that makes it sound like you can appeal it. You know, it's not clear if this is going to be enforceable. My general inclination is try to move forward quickly with something. I'd even go forward with it as is, but trying to add to it and make it tougher, I'm not sure is the right answer. But I do think it imperative that we get something rolling to see if this actually works. I mean, we're kind of going out on what seems to be kind of a new branch here that people haven't tried before, and I think that's wonderful for us to try that. But I don't want us to get too carried away with trying to implement everything we'd like to see really across the board in fire as part of this checklist. Those are my thoughts.
Okay. Do you think that a 4-foot setback deserves a a more restrictive set of requirements? Because I mean, I think that would be the argument.
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that the amount of setback shows up again and again and again, 4 foot, 30 foot, 100 foot, they all have merit. And yeah, the closer you get, I mean, it's pretty clear. Well, all the experts seem to think that it makes a difference. So, I mean, I think we'd have to write that into the general law though, right? We couldn't just say it's just these ADUs. It'd have to be like, oh, we're writing our general law that says if you get anything within 4 foot, then you got to go non-combustible, is how I sort of think it should go at a top level. But I'm willing to try it if we want to push something through here. I just think that's where we need to end up, is having it apply across the board. Anything that gets too close would have higher and higher fire building code restrictions on it.
Okay, great. Who's next? Anne? Do you have
Sure.
any comments?
No, as you all know, I really like the carrot and stick approach. So I actually love this. In my mind, this is a very big stick on wanting to build within 4 feet. There is just gonna be a big old list of things you got to do, but I like it. I feel like these are things that, if you're really going to be fire safe, you'd put down for everybody and every property. That's hard to do though, because it takes away people's property rights or houses they've thought about building or they have built. If they burn down, they would not be able to rebuild on their property. That's harsh. This feels like a great way to start down this path. The 4 feet thing only came into existence at the beginning of 2020. So nobody's had their heart set, for a long time on building an ADU in this area. So I feel fine about putting very strict rules about when you can do it. So I basically like all these, even though I think, maybe I think this 20%, 100 feet is going to take out loads of properties that, just will not be able to do anything in 4 feet, which I didn't like the 4 feet. So that's good. I do want then some details as we talked about the 20%. I do think it should be specified to be upslope, and if some language can be in there to make sure, just if somebody has this like a berm that's 20% but only 4 feet high, that doesn't trigger it. I like sticking with the non-combustible. That seems good to me. I think that 5 bad plants, the 100 feet should be specified that it's within the property line, not the neighbor can, has to remove things. I didn't like this wording that the fire chief could come up with an alternative. I mean, now we heard from him, the fire marshal, it sounded like there isn't one. I really like things that make it sound like it's clear, like there's not all kinds of side things you can do. And do we have to specify that there can be an appeal? I mean, I think we're the planning commission. On all other topics, people can always come to us for a variance, right? I do like that process. I feel like even though we're very smart and thoughtful, there's still quirks, in people's lot. Or here I'm trying to think through all the ways you could have a 20% slope, but if somebody had something that was quirky that we didn't think about, I feel like there should be a way for them to come and meet the spirit of what we were trying to do, even if our legal language didn't hit it. So, but then I'm also pleased and I'm glad to be part of a commission that, we don't grant many variances. People's story better be pretty special, not just, if they don't like it and they want to build a certain house. So as long as we stick with that, I'm in favor of it. That's all my comments.
Great, thanks, Anne. Nicholas, do you want to talk a little about this appeal process in a little more depth? You're on mute.
I would first like to unmute myself so that I can be talking to somebody other than me. I guess before we get there, there are a couple of items, and that is, one is there's a limitation on planting native plants. I like native plants, but I am unclear whether native plants have a nexus to fire safety. And I don't have expertise in native plants and fire safety. But I'm wondering if there's somebody who can speak to that and what that nexus might be.
Through the chair,
Yeah, please.
the Conservation Committee has a list of native plants that are more fire safe. So they have a list that they've already established. So that's the list that we propose to use for this.
But for example, let's say I want to have a succulent garden. I don't much like succulent gardens. Other people might, and that seems like a pretty fire safe. I'm making it up. I don't have the expertise, but it seems reasonable to think that a succulent garden would be pretty fire resistant.
It is. And it's,
So,
and
go ahead.
it is, and it can be included in there. In fact, it's included in my guidelines for homeowners to do their own assessments, stating that succulents can be planted in a 0 to 5 foot.
So I would love to generally legislate that we should plant natives, but I don't think that this is the vehicle in which to do that. And I'm wondering if there is some appropriate way to broaden out what acceptable planting might be that is fire safe or martial, that is within the category of appropriate plants within the zone from your perspective. Again, I don't mean to take anything away from the Conservation Commission or committee, but I'm not sure that this is the vehicle to move that forward.
I agree with you. It doesn't necessarily have to be limited to just the low fire hazard California native plant published by the Conservation Committee. There's many other plants that will work in that 0 to 5 foot zone. And I think we can clearly put that language in there and include, if they want to use the native plant list, they can, but you're not limited to just using that.
So if I could, through the chair, our intent with this was to create the most simple solution, especially given the timelines for review of ADUs. So if we have a very specific plant list where only those things are allowed, then it's just a ministerial, the planner is looking at the plants, making sure they're all on the list, and if so, then approve. Otherwise, there's going to be some judgment. So either the fire district staff or my staff would have to have something that they are reviewing against. So that was my intent in terms of the way it was drafted.
And Don, you had mentioned that there was a list that you were hoping to sort of amend the language. I mean, is that a prescriptive list?
Are we talking about the plants still around the structure?
Yeah. You had basically said that instead of, you wanted something that was the flammable 5, but there were the grasses and the Cody brush. And it sounded like that was coming from a specific list.
Yes, it's coming from a specific list out of the fire code, which is
Right.
required. It's required. Now, I'm just thinking that it's better that we put it in there so that people know ahead of time that I can still come in and enforce that on the property. But it's better that it's on the list now so that they know exactly what they need to do when they're clearing it.
Right. And Laura, I guess I'm just wondering, could we just use that list and say it can't be any of the things on this list? And then leave it open from there.
Yeah, I mean, it's already law now. It's written in the fire code. You need to do that. I think we may be extending it. It says 50 to 100 feet, but we're saying 100 feet in this purpose.
So we're talking about two slightly different things. So my understanding is that Fire Marshal is talking about the existing defensible space requirements that have to do with the maintenance of planting, vegetation management, those types of things. What we were talking about here was new planting of new plants in proximity to the ADU. So they already have to do their defensible space. That can already be enforced by the fire district. We want to put it into the checklist for informational purposes. So that's how I'm understanding that. So we could add that language for informational purposes, but different than this idea of adding new planting in proximity to the ADU. And that's where planning staff was recommending using the conservation checklist.
Right, but why not just say, you can plant new stuff as long as it's not basically stuff that's prohibited by defensible space? I mean, I guess I'm not sure, to Nicholas's point, I want to put a succulent garden in. They're not native. I don't really see any reason why we should be limiting that. I mean,
Because it's,
I guess I'm not quite sure what it is that you think they're gonna plant that Don would let go, but somehow we don't want to have them plant.
Well, there's a lot of plants that fall in the middle. They're not necessarily objectionable. They're not the worst. They're not, you're not forced to remove them under your defensible space requirements, but they're not preferred according to the standards of being native and fire safe. So this is also a stick in the carrot and stick approach. The idea is that if you want your less than the standard setbacks, then you need to meet this very high standard of what you're gonna plant.
and it's really simple, and don't ask us.
So I'm all in favor of being simple and being fire safe. And I might ask the town attorney whether or not it's important to have a nexus between fire safe and the sticks that we're including.
So it's a little awkward to have some non-fire related sticks appear on the fire safety checklist, but from a legal standpoint, it's fine to have additional sticks. And so for instance, in the ordinance itself, we're not permitting additional amenities and spas and that type of thing. And that's not necessarily tied to fire safety issues. It's just creating some disincentives to build in the setbacks. So I would treat the plant materials as one of those. And it also, the way it's worded, there is that nexus because we are specifying exactly what types of fire safe plantings are permitted.
So what I'm hearing you say is that there's no problem. It doesn't weaken our position vis-a-vis HCD to have non-fire related sticks associated with allowing people, applicants to be within the 4-foot setback.
Correct.
Well, then we can kind of pile on then, can't we? Is what I'm hearing you say.
Yes, and that's what we tried to pile on in the ordinance, and you have quite a few disincentives already factored into the ordinance. The intent of this particular checklist really is to narrow things down to the fire-related issues. If you want to add some additional sticks, that would be more appropriate for a subsequent amendment to the ordinance, which I must warn you is coming soon because this is an iterative process, and certainly there will be some lessons learned as we move forward.
So my general view is I'd like to keep this as fire specific, this fire protection checklist oriented towards fire. If we aren't going to do that, or in addition to that, and also to create some flexibility to allow our succulent garden, I would propose having an approval for deviation from this checklist. And I think that the kind of judgment that would need to be exercised would need to be expert judgment pertaining to fire safety, rather than in judgment as to what color the foliage should be in the fall, for example. And which the fire marshal does not have expertise in, I do not believe. But I would like to have a safety valve here. So the means and methods, I think planning director is what you called it. That would create the some relief in the event that it's necessary, with the orientation being fire protection.
But
I think that would also have an added benefit of creating a more defensible position before HCD, which I also see as valuable, but that needs to be weighed against the administrative burden that may be placed on the fire marshal and the district more generally.
So I was going to say, you know, with respect to the planting, we have a conservation committee that's created a list of fire safe plants that do happen to be native, which we also encourage. And the fact that we choose to make that a simple part of our checklist and not worry about deviations or appeals seems to me really what we're trying to accomplish with our stick here. It's like, it's super easy to implement. We don't have to have a thinking process. We don't have to have an appeal. Hopefully we won't have a lot of these come through with this being a big enough stick. So again, I kind of think we're overthinking this in terms of trying to make it more than it really is, and trying to deal with things on a total level, as opposed to saying, no, this is just something really specific. And these other things that people are bringing up, yeah, we should be dealing with the whole fire safe thing across the board. But let's not try to over engineer this one and make it cumbersome. Sorry, my thoughts.
I agree with that. I feel like this is a list that already exists in the town, so let's use it. You know, Nicholas, you're bringing up succulents, and okay, they seem like they got a lot of water to me, so maybe fire resistant. But what if somebody comes and they want to plant some English boxwood hedge, right? Somebody's got to go research then what's the fire propensity of that, right? Or some other plant they've got their heart set on. I feel like, oh no, we already have this list. Conservation Committee made it. Yeah, you want to build 4 feet? Here's your list.
So for example, if somebody wants to put in a lily pond with lotuses in it, I would be pretty irritated if we weren't able to approve that.
Not me. Boy, I say you really got your heart set on it. Get your ADU back to the setback that the town started with.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting. I'm really focused on fire safety and protection, which is, I think, what the flexibility is that's been created within the state law. And I'd really like to slot myself squarely into that space rather than adding on. If we want to do something different, maybe we should say you can go and you can have your structure within 4 feet, provided you make a $100,000 donation to the town. I mean, that'd be cool. But that, I think, would be pretty far off from what HCD is trying to do and what the legislature is trying to do here. And if the legislature is given a space to create a more protective ordinance for ourselves on the basis of fire safety, again, I'd like to do that. I also don't want to end up monopolizing the fire marshal's time based on supposed appeals. So that's the issue. And I think that there may simply be a difference in opinion of what this checklist is meant to do, which I think is interesting and is worth talking about. Or maybe there's a consensus to which I don't belong at the moment, but it'd be worth rounding it out.
So can I move us back up to I think the larger issue here is whether there is an appeal process. So do you want to speak to that? Because that was sort of how we got on to this topic. And I don't think you weren't just talking about an appeal process for planting, right? I thought you were talking for a broader appeal process for the checklist.
I'm interested in having fire safe ADUs within 4 feet. And a checklist, I think, creates a basis for doing that. I think there may be additional ways to create that kind of flexibility. And the question that I have is whether it's possible to do that without overburdening the process. And I don't have an opinion on that. I'm authentically looking for guidance from staff and from the fire marshal.
So Laura, do you want to comment maybe on this idea that, when you submit your checklist, you could say, I'd like to appeal this restriction and how that might function?
If I could take a step back into the broader picture for a moment, what I'm
Sure.
thinking about is that we have a very complex ADU ordinance that the Planning Commission recommended and the council adopted. I think it's a very strong ordinance, but it already has a lot of complexity to it that is going to present some challenges to implement consistently. And so I think it is, my interest from a staff point of view to simplify the things that we can that still meet the policy objectives that you're trying to meet. So from my point of view, to simplify things and not have an appeal from an administrative point of view, I think is a good idea. And creating the simplest forms and checklists and materials that still meet the policy objectives would be my preference. Now, how we would create an appeal process, if you want to recommend one, I think I didn't think about this in advance. So I don't, have a specific proposal for you. People we'd have to have some type of criteria that we would still be trying to achieve. We would have to establish that criteria, that we would have to be clear on who was implementing it and who had the decision-making authority. So if it was an appeal on certain areas, that would be with the town and planning and building. If it was an appeal in other areas, then that might be with the fire marshal at the fire district. So because this is a joint effort to implement this checklist, I think that's fairly complex to do.
Okay, well, let's see where the commission ends up, and if we need to go down that path, then we can further flesh it out. Nicholas, do you have other comments before I move on to Judith?
Just one real quick about the new planting, since we were on it. That was just one item that was on there about using the conservation committee. But if you look to the next item below that, where it talks about the critical fire zone, zone 0 to 5, or basically we call it zone 1, 0 to 5 feet out from the foundation of the house. It says right there, it says no new landscape cover except for low growing 18-inch or less herbaceous, non-woody ground cover or succulent plants near the structure. So that still expands it, but still restricts it. It expands it from, you don't have to stick with the list, but it also tells you what you can and can't use, how high, and what can go there in that 0 to 5 feet. That's what we're talking about, is that critical zone where it's right up against the structure. Beyond that, other things can be used, but we don't want to be using flammable vegetation that we know will endanger property. And I would have to agree with Laura on the appeals process. If somebody were to tell me I want to appeal, just pick any one of these windows, exterior walls and siding, my first question is going to be why? I know this to be the safest way to build the house. What's the reason? What reason can you give me that you want to appeal this that I'm going to agree with you? I'm not.
I tend to agree with you. And I would also tend to think that the answer is very likely going to be no. You can appeal, but your appeal will be very quickly decided
Right.
in the negative, which maybe is a recommendation for having an appeal process simply because it's not very challenging based on experience. I'm going to move off of this in just 1 second, and we'll move on to other folks. But let me ask the town attorney, do you think that we would have a stronger chance of sustaining our ordinance or this portion of the ordinance if we had an appeal versus not?
So appeals and safety valves are always recommended elements of an ordinance. And we did consider that in drafting the overall ordinance. And we thought that we didn't have the infrastructure at this point in time to entertain that appeal. So, you know, you always have to balance resources with legal vulnerability. And I do also think that Commissioner Coffstill's point about the variance process that could be utilized is also an appropriate one.
Interesting. So we might cross-reference an opportunity for a variance here, which would plug us into an existing
Process.
That gets us maybe 40% there. But 40% is better than dead in the water. Good. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Is that it?
Chair?
Yeah. Judith?
Yep. I just want a point of clarification. This goes to the new planting check here versus what the current law requires, the fire code. Is the fire code, I'm not familiar with exactly what it does. Does it say you shall not use the following plants, or does it have lists of okay plants? Can you refresh me?
It says, basically, you shall not use is what it says. Yeah. That
Okay.
only has to deal with defensible space. So that's the area around the structure.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Because, okay, I'll take these not in a particular order. I think we're in a tough situation because we're looking for insight into HCD, and we as a group don't have it. And the town attorney is very omniscient, but she doesn't have it either. And so we're dealing with doing the best we can and making sure we feel that this is the right balance for the right reason. So for me, the more things are tied to fire safety, a little bit better. So for example, non-combustible versus fire resistant, I'd be fine with non-combustible. I think I understand the fire marshal's view on that. And, you know, if you're within 4 feet of a property line, I think that's tied to fire safety. So for me, that would be fine. The issues in the checklist for me are really around the landscaping and defensible space piece, and they're narrow. The new planting check sticks out to me because it references, first of all, it's unclear how it applies to the 0 to 5 feet, because this says all new planting has to be California low hazard native. And if you look at that list, it's 6 pages long. There's only 18 trees on it, and there's a lot of very limited choice. These are things that are native to Portola Valley itself. So to me, it goes beyond being tied pretty closely to the fire concern. It goes to a couple of different concerns, and it is a 6-page list that's not very dense. So it does seem overly limiting. And, you know, I'm trying to be pragmatic here. I think an appeals process probably would not work here. I like the idea of being able to reference a variance. There's not going to be many people who seek that out. And I have sympathy for Laura trying to say, I need a black or white, is it an okay plant or not? But you either have the chance to reference, don't do anything that the fire code doesn't let you do. I am thinking the new planting could come over as more dictatorial than it needs to be for fire safety. And so I don't love it. I don't know that that's the benefit. I personally would just strike it for this particular purpose, because I do support the others and understand the others as being tied to fire safety. The upslope versus downslope, to me, I defer to the fire marshal here, because I think if you're worried about the creation of the fire or the protection of the building, upslope versus downslope, I think he's still got concerns, but whatever we're trying to cover from a fire safety standpoint, I'm okay with. So I don't feel strongly that we need to limit it to upslope myself. And I think those are the big picture items. I guess my last comment or question for Laura is there a vehicle, or what would the vehicle for updating the checklist be? Because I think once we have our general fire home hardening statutes going on, and maybe, the Conservation Committee starts updating its lists, is there a process that you would refresh this every so often, or what would happen in the ordinary course? I'm not trying to be adding process here. I just want to know how you'd view that if things that impinged on home hardening made it clearer, or that some of this was not necessary, or there's a couple of new things that are needed now that people have been through the whole process.
What I expect to happen is that we would keep an eye on all of our different policies that are related to fire safety, and try to make sure that they're consistent and that they speak to each other. So I would expect that we would have a periodic update of this checklist. It's, something that's adopted by the council by resolution is the way that we have it set up. So it would have to do that. And then I think consistent with the tradition of the town and other land use related policies under state law, we would come to the Planning Commission for recommendation on that path. So I think this is something that, could be and would be updated in the future. In regards to the building code requirements that we're working on, that are in draft form now, this is definitely informed by that. And so we don't think it will be inconsistent, but certainly as we continue to learn, we may want to change this as, we just progress along this path of fire safety.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Judith. So I guess when I look at this, I hear John say, well, we're only focused on this one thing and let's not get ahead of ourselves. But I do think that in some ways, this is sort of a template for some of the stuff we want to do with home hardening. So I guess I do worry about us getting too far out in front of ourselves for things that are beyond just the 4 feet. In other words, even though in theory, this is only stuff that's in the setback, I think once we sort of put this down, it's going to become a template for other things. So I'm with Judith. I'm not this planting thing seems too restrictive to me. I'd be happy if we said we'd prefer you do natives. I think that's fine. And then the rest of it, I think, is limited by the fire code saying what you can't plant. And if you want to put in a koi pond, excuse me, then I'm okay with that. I don't think that's something that we should be restricting. And particularly if this becomes a more general template, I definitely don't think that's something we should restrict. So I think I would move that. I think the appeal process sounds too complicated. I'm fine referencing the variance process and using that as sort of a, maybe a kind of a hard escape valve, but at least, you know, some kind of escape valve. And then I think as we move forward on this, you know, as home hardening, you know, as we get more and more restrictive on the general home hardening, I would always expect that anything outside the setback is at least as restrictive, if not more restrictive than whatever we end up with the home hardening. So I would expect that this would get modified if the home hardening for some reason was more restrictive than this checklist. I think that's where I come out. So the upslope, downslope, I don't have a strong feeling on.
Craig, sorry, just a quick add-on. I do really want it to be made clear, and mention this, that these landscaping and defensible spaces checks only impinge on the relevant property. They do not create burdens or rights with respect to anything outside the property line.
Yeah, I think we sort of mentioned that a couple of times, but I would completely agree is this is up to the property line. So this is, you know, the smaller of 100 feet or whatever, or the property line. I mean, and in my neighborhood, since my lot isn't even 100 feet wide, you know, it's sort of, my neighbors wouldn't be happy if it was, you know, restrictive in any other way. So yeah, I have no problem with that. And I think that was the intention. I just don't think we very clearly specified it.
Can I make a quick comment on the slope?
Yeah.
You know, Rusty's comment about the slope being on the, or the structure being on the downhill side of the slope is absolutely correct. I was thinking in the terms of, you know, typically you think of a house at the top of the slope, but it's the same dynamics with the house being right up against the slope, even on the downhill side. If that house were to catch fire and that would extend into the wildland and move up that slope, it's going to move up it very fast, and it's going to, if there's a neighboring property up at the top, it's going to get there that much quicker than if the house was offset off of that slope so that it couldn't get to it. So you have to think about it in both terms.
So I kind of go on I understand Ann's point on the slope. I wouldn't try to deal with it here in the sense of it's kind of it's something we need to talk about on our overall fire area. If this one happens to be more restrictive than we end up with going forward, we can either leave it more restricted, or we can change it so that it's the same. It's not one that I feel we have to solve at the moment.
I'm fine with that.
And as far as taking out that new planting with the conservation committee, that's very minor. I agree with that too.
Yeah, if everybody would just said, if Judith, I think, said maybe just strike it.
Yeah, that's minor.
That would be fine. I mean, I'd go for it with it in, I'd go for it without. It's like, that's certainly fine with me. And I know, Craig, you thought you disagreed with me in the sense of maybe getting too far ahead of yourselves, but actually I was trying to say some of the same things in terms of, yeah, it's like, let's just keep this one small, narrow, and focused, and let's deal with those issues that people are clearly, like, they make sense. Let's deal with them on a holistic level. Let's get this thing through them.
Sure.
So
And I think all I was saying is in the plantings, saying we want all natives, that feels like that's something else, that it's not, that seems like a more general principle that we'd like to have natives, which, you know, we can have that debate. That's a different debate.
I mean,
That doesn't
Nicholas's point
feel-
is good. Keep it focused on fire. The more we can just say that's what we're doing, that makes sense. Totally.
Yeah, and I'm fine if somewhere, I don't know if it belongs in a checklist. I mean, if we said we prefer natives that are on this list, that's fine too, but that seems more like, you know, sort of guidelines, sort of design guidelines. And I think we already have those, don't we?
Yeah, we were just trying to make, I think the point was make it super simple from a checklist. If it's a
Yeah,
checklist
no, yeah,
reference.
I get it. So,
And it's focused on fire safety. That would be the one thing that if you struck that, everything else would be focused on fire safety.
Yeah.
Yeah.
100%.
okay, so with that, I think what I heard was we'd like to add some reference to the variance process. We want to add that this is defensible space up to the property line. I mean, you know, like the distance or the property line, whichever's less. We're striking the planting requirement. Is there anything else in terms of modifying this that we want to capture?
There was a thought about adding some in, I thought Don mentioned
Yeah.
adding a couple of other plants onto the list.
Well, yeah, I think referencing the code of what plants are not allowed.
Yeah, as opposed to just the
Correct.
5. So
Yeah, okay.
We talked about striking that sentence after the automated fire sprinkler, that the fire marshal may approve alternate means.
Yeah, I don't think that should be in there.
Okay.
And I guess I would ask the attorney, I mean, presumably you thought you put that in there because you were thinking that the variance as the sort of escape valve wasn't strong enough. Because I don't have a problem with us putting it in there under the assumption, Don, that unless there's some new technology that shows up next year, they're going to come and you're going to just say no, and that's going to kind of be the end of it. So if, you know, if Cara thinks that having this in here is I'll put significant without qualifying what significant means, improvement from HCD's point of view, then I would leave it. Because that's certainly in my mind, the most expensive thing that we're putting in here. And it does seem like HCD's pretty sensitive to those, you just priced people out of building an ADU. And they could look at something like this and say, nah, no way. Whereas if at least we said you'd review it, maybe it would get by. I don't know, but that'd be my feeling is I feel like it's an easy enough thing for you to nix if they don't truly come up with a good alternative. And it doesn't really affect the other sort of, you know, planning and plan check and stuff, other than if there's some other thing that somebody comes up with that you approve, then obviously they just have to make sure that was in the plans. So would you be comfortable with that?
Yeah, that would be easy for us to do.
Yeah, okay. So I think that's my preference. What do other people think? Are other people okay with leaving the appeal process on the sprinklers in?
I don't like it unless Cara just says it really helps the chances through HCD. I feel like here we've got this sentence that makes it sound like something. And if a resident came and asked anyone on the planning commission or the fire marshal, like, what's an example? We'd all be like, there is none. We just threw that sentence in there. I don't like that.
Well, and the way I would look at it is I would say that in a year from now or 2 years from now, if somebody came up with some other technology, you flood the house with non-flammable blah, 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 and that would do the equivalent or better. I don't see why Don wouldn't say that's okay. And we didn't require sprinklers. I mean, so that's sort of my sense is we may not know what it is today. That doesn't mean it won't exist.
So I kind of think I'm with Craig on this. I actually agree with you in the sense of I like to be upfront and forward and straightforward and be as clear as I can. This, given that they've made such a big deal about not saying you have to have sprinklers in an ADU, seems to me like I'm guessing, I'm not a politician, I'm not any good at that at all. I'm kind of guessing that would be one where giving ourselves a little wiggle room might be the right political answer,
Hmm.
even if it's not something I would normally want to go along with.
Okay.
There's only one instance I can think of right now that actually happened in district, and that was where they wanted to put a fog system instead of an automatic fire sprinkler system in the building, which is a lot more expensive, but they're not designed for residential use. They're designed for commercial use and other uses. And so the former fire marshal asked them, said, you get a letter from the manufacturer stating that this will work in a residential dwelling, then I'll accept it. And they did, and it worked out. But other than that, I mean, we can keep it open for that. If something like that in the future happens, then.
Another example could be if the property owner owned the adjoining property and maybe was willing to put a deed restriction that they wouldn't locate another structure within a certain distance.
That's
You know,
good.
there certainly are some other possibilities here.
Okay.
Well, like typically it works the other way around. It's, if they can't meet the driveway requirements or the distance requirements, then I'd say, okay, you give me sprinklers and then I'll give you the driveway.
Right, yeah. So Anne, are you, I realize this is not ideal, but
Yeah.
is it okay?
Yeah, I can go with it.
Okay. All right,
Okay,
so are we missing anything else here? Basically, we got the property line, the variance and the code reference.
It'd be okay to put the code reference in there, the wording from the code reference?
I think so. That's sort of what I'm suggesting. Vision.
Works for me.
I'm not seeing any strong dissent from commissioners, so yeah, I think that would be fine.
I think that would.
I mean, it's
add-
still, it's real anyway. It's just a matter
Yeah.
of communication.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay, so other than those three, anything else that I missed in the conversation?
I can ask the fire marshal if there are items that are not included that he would consider including.
Yes, I talked about that early on, and that would be referencing, you know, if we're talking about making these non-combustible, then what would be referencing the NFPA standards for the difference between ignition resistant and non-combustible, and what are the standards for clarification on that?
I like that.
That would be important.
So Laura, normally, doesn't the main ordinance have definitions? And couldn't that be included as part of the definitions in terms of what is combustible or not combustible, and it adheres to these standards?
Typically in a zoning ordinance, that's how we would do it. But building codes and fire codes are a little bit different, and we want this document to stand alone and not have to cross-reference too much. But I think referencing this section in the checklist that the fire marshal is recommending, I think is useful. I think
Okay.
that's a good recommendation.
Sounds great.
So I'm good with that as well. All right, so now I'm up to 4 small changes. Anything else? Okay.
Through the chair,
So-
I actually have 5 items, just
Okay, what's
to
the
make
fifth
sure.
one?
So the language is up to the property line,
Yeah.
reference to the variance process,
Yeah.
strike the planting requirement, the fire
okay.
marshal's language on defensible space, and then the fire marshal's reference to the NFPA standards for non-combustible.
Yeah, fine. Your strike was, I wasn't counting the things we were taking out. I was just counting the things we were adding in, but
That
fair
was a
enough.
minus as opposed to a
I
plus.
accept your correction. Because that's certainly a change to what we have. So all right. So I think those are the 5 that we have.
I'd make a motion to move the fire safety checklist forward, including those 5 changes we just noted.
And
I'll
could
second.
Right. Can I make a friendly amendment to that? That we have one planning commission review the final text with Laura. I assume Laura and Cara are going to write this up.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, we would make these changes. The fire marshal and I would make these changes according
Right.
to your recommendations. We can certainly have one planning commissioner take a look at that before we send it on to council for
that
their
be you, Craig?
consideration.
I'm happy to do it. I
Let's have
mean,
Craig do it.
okay, great.
And just confirming that the motion is to adopt the resolution that has been provided with those
Absolutely.
5 changes.
Correct. That was exactly what I meant to say. With Craig reviewing it after the fact.
Okay. And Anne, are you comfortable seconding that with the friendly amendment?
Yeah, yes.
All right. Is there any discussion? All right, with that, Laura, could you do a roll call, please?
Commissioner Goulden,
Aye.
Commissioner Haskell,
Aye.
Commissioner Targ,
Aye.
Vice Chair Koff-Still,
Aye.
Chair Taylor.
Aye. Passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone.
And we still have 5 attendees.
You, yeah, now we're gonna move on. Yeah. Okay, so next up is the Planning Commission ASCC joint minute draft, joint meeting draft minutes of 6/30/2021. Do we have any comments on that?
Yep.
Go ahead, Judith.
Okay, read page 14. It's the paragraph starting Commissioner Haskell said. I recall, and you can feel free to go back and listen, that I asked whether the public could have a tour. I was looking for Stanford to tell me whether or not they thought that could work. Later on, I concluded it was unlikely, but right there, I was asking the question. Midway down that page, I didn't see Dana's last name. So it just says Dana asked if a tree disposition plan. If she hasn't been introduced previously, you probably have to add her last name.
And that would have been Dana Breen.
Yep. And then, let's see, red page 20, typo, first full paragraph, own attorney should be town attorney. And midway down, Vice Chair Wilson asked, it sounds a little weird. I defer to the tape, but she has heard rumors that the HOA does not support the project. I don't know what HOA she was talking about. Just defer to the tape on that. And last on this set, page 21, last paragraph, Town Attorney Silva remarked that there are local regulation. I think it just needs an S on the end. And that is it for those.
Man, I have 3 corrections that you didn't catch. This is so awesome.
Excellent.
I am looking forward to my turn. All right, does anybody else have comments on the joint meeting? John?
No.
Nicholas?
I was not present at that.
Okay. Anne?
No.
Okay. I feel so good. This never happens. It's really trivial. They're just typos. There are 3 references to Alpine Drive on red page 17 and 18. And I believe you want Alpine Road.
Oh, good catch.
Yeah. That's what I'm good for, the minutia. All right. Are there any other comments before I open it up to the public? All right. So now I'm going to open it up to the public. Are there any comments on the minutes of the joint ASCC Planning Commission meeting? And there are 4 attendees still left. Thank you for your hardcore attendance. Craig Hughes raised his hand. All right, Craig, go ahead.
Yes, merely just to comment on your amendment to add Dana's last name. Looking at the names, I think those were all people's Zoom user IDs, because there are a couple places where people's names are abbreviated, and I recognize that pattern as being how people sign into Zoom. So it's not that it was Dana and she didn't identify herself; it's she's being identified by her Zoom username.
That seems a little problematic, since some of these Zoom names are like, they're not even the people who are talking. So,
Hey, it wasn't PV Lily.
yeah, well, fair enough. So, all right, so let me stay with public. Are there any other public comments? I don't see anybody raising their hand. All right, so can I get a motion to approve the joint meeting? From somebody?
Motion to approve?
Thank you. Second? Come on, you guys, work with me. Nicholas is not going to do it because he wasn't there.
Second.
Not gonna happen, sorry.
Thank you. All right. Any further discussion? All right. Can I get a roll call?
I'm sorry, the box is moved, so I had to regroup for a second. Commissioner
moved up.
Golden,
Yeah, yes, I approve. Aye.
Commissioner Targ,
I abstain.
Commissioner Haskell,
Approve. Aye.
Vice Chair Koff-Still,
Abstain.
Chair Taylor.
Aye. All right, so that's approved with two abstentions. Right, so next up, we have the Planning Commission draft minutes from 7/7. Are there comments on minutes? Judith? You
Yeah.
don't have any
couple-
comments, do you?
I have a couple. Read page 24. The paragraph starting Rusty Day addressed. The very last line, he expressed his frustration that residences have to bring up these issues. It should be residents with a TS. Give me a minute, I'm scrolling. Yep, that's it. That's it for that.
Okay, thank you. Any other commissioners have comments? No. Okay. Let me open it up to the public. Is there anybody who would like to comment on the Planning Commission, draft minutes? All right, seeing none, I would entertain a motion to approve.
I'll make that motion.
Thank
And I'll
you.
second.
Thank you. Excellent. All right, any further discussion? Laura, can we get roll call, please?
Commissioner Golden,
I approve.
Commissioner Haskell,
Aye.
Commissioner Targ,
Aye.
Vice Chair Koff-Still,
Aye.
Chair Taylor.
Aye. All right, motion passes unanimously. Thank you. Now I would gladly entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that.
Oh, yeah, for a minute, I thought you guys didn't want to adjourn. You were starting to make me worried.
Second.
I have a second.
We don't need a roll call. Aye. All
All
right.
right,
you have to
so
call
I have
for it.
a motion,
By
a second,
acclamation.
all in, but we do have to have a vote. I mean, you
Okay,
still
go
have
for
to
it,
vote.
Greg. Hurry up.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 Aye. Excellent. All right, meeting is adjourned. Yeah, thank you, Marshall, for joining.
Nice to meet you.
Thank you all.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
All right.
Good
Thanks,
night.
everyone.
Have a good
Good
night.
night. Good night.
Take care.